From the Sky News Centre, this is Paul Murray Live.
Thank you, Shari. Now, apparently the handsome little boy from Marrickville has reset our relationship with China. Also, the Prime Minister would have you believe how many meetings, how many handshakes, how many cuddles. Of course, the reality is that many of the economic pressures that were placed upon our country as revenge for us trying to stand up to what China did, or more importantly didn't do when it comes to COVID, have now gone. So the money's flowing, everything's okay, right? No. China remains the aggressor, China remains the national security threat, and China came this close to killing members of our Defence Force on the weekend. There was an incident involving an Australian helicopter on Saturday evening. It was in what is called the Yellow Sea. This is the area, as you can see on this map, which is South Korea, North Korea, to the left, China. Now, China, all of this area remains international waters, but Australians are involved in trying to stop people smuggling things out of North Korea, past South Korea and onto the rest of the world. Andrew Probyn had the exclusive tonight at 6 p.m. on Channel 9 about how China almost killed Australian pilots.
The Seahawk was intercepted by a Chinese J-10 Air Force jet.
The PLA Air Force plane dropped flares about 300 metres in front of the Seahawk helicopter and about 60 metres above it.
Now, the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, is of course China. For the most obvious of reasons, our government will never use words like China as the aggressor in this situation. Now, despite the fact that all of those flares were fired very closely to an Australian helicopter, the only reason we are not talking about Australian members of the Defence Force being killed by China is because of this.
Only quick reflexes by the Australian pilot averted disaster.
Minister, I've been told that this was so serious it almost took one of our choppers out of the sky.
This was an incident which was both unsafe and unprofessional.
Where is the outrage? Where is the indignation that China, yet again, does something to endanger the lives of the members of the Australian Defence Force? In that interview here, they're not even referred to as China, it's the PLA. The situation was one where only the skill of the Australian pilot is the reason why we are talking about the near miss as opposed to catastrophe. And it's not the first time that China have put our members of the Defence Force in danger. You'd recall last year a situation involving HMAS Toowoomba, when, of course, the Chinese fired sonar at our divers and they were injured. You would also remember that the Australian public was not told about this incident until after the Prime Minister had returned from a meeting in the United States where he had met face-to-face with the Chinese President. You would also remember that the Prime Minister refused to say whether he raised the incident of one country's army versus another country's Defence Force, and whether he raised it face-to-face with the man who, of course, holds the keys to whether Australia will be punished or let off the hook economically. The Prime Minister, of course, did not raise it, and you could tell that by his own words.
You're copping a fair bit of flack over it, accusations you didn't raise it with the Chinese leadership in San Francisco. Can you clear that up?
Well, we've raised it very clearly through all of the normal channels. We had, when I was in San Francisco, there was no bilateral meeting with President Xi where you give a readout of what the events occurred. I don't talk about private meetings on the sidelines, discussions I have with any world leader. That's how you keep communications open. But I can assure you that we raised these issues in the appropriate way.
What a disgrace. You saw the meeting face to face. Now, very obviously, it may not play out before the cameras, but hey, Mr. President, we've got 30 seconds. Can we just go over here? Don't ever do that again. Pretty simple, right? Oh, no, but it's China. The way that they could have a go at our wine industry or our lobster industry. Yet China, well, they, of course, said it was all garbage. They said it was not true. In fact, they even at one point in time said that it was Japan that was the particular concern. He even turned around and said that there was an implied threat in his response. Not only did he say we weren't involved in it, but if we did do it, your Navy divers would have been killed.
Should they have initiated the sonar from the Chinese ship, it would cause immediate fatality.
Again, let's go back to May of 2022. Another significant incident, this time involving fighter jets. These fighter jets, again, ended up in a confrontation with Australian forces. Our colleague here at Sky News, Chris Ullman, was the one who broke it in Channel 9 back then.
May 26, a RAF P-8 surveillance plane was on a routine exercise in international airspace over the South China Sea when it was intercepted by a Chinese J-16 jet fighter, which drew very close alongside and released flares. The warplane then accelerated, cut in front of the RAF jet and deployed a cloud of aluminium strips known as chaff, some of which entered the Australian plane's engines.
And before that, remember the time when Australians who were flying planes had military-grade lasers fired into the windows of where the pilot was. Again, if it had burnt their eye, if it had distracted them significantly enough, just like the previous, near disaster. The Prime Minister at the time referred to it as an act of intimidation. Meantime, China turned around and said it didn't happen. It maliciously, Australia was spreading disinformation. Now, this is very significant. Do we need to go to war with China tomorrow as a result of it? No. But should people understand how close the latest incident was, and it is an upscale in China's attacks on members of our Defence Force. To all of the men and women who serve our country, doing the jobs that many people wouldn't even know that they are doing, we send them nothing but strength and love and admiration. To the government, who refuses to share the rage of the families left behind while these people serve overseas and get involved in these scenarios of near-death experiences with China. Could the government please muster the courage to be slightly pissed off, just slightly? But of course that would offend the special relationship with the handsome boy from the Housing Commission place in Marrickville with the dog Toto and all the other garbage we've had to put up with. Now, in his quieter moments, the Prime Minister probably would consider himself to be a little bit Bob Hawke, beloved by the Australian people, a suburban larrikin. He'd be the big man who changed the country forever, like, of course, Gough Whitlam. These are their official portraits in the federal parliament. But the reality of Albanese is that he's as weak as Kevin Rudd when it comes to so many areas of policy. What about that as an official portrait? Oh, Chess and the kitty cat is here as well. I'm such a genius. And he's as ineffective as Julia Gillard at being able to handle the issues that Australians desperately need dealt with. Because one thing has now become incredibly clear after almost 2 years of this bloke as our Prime Minister. Any and every problem that will cause him any pain whatsoever is swept under the rug. Like, take your pick when it comes to broken promises, like, say, this one about power prices.
$275, $275, $275, $275, $275, $275, $275, $275.
But not only have your power bills dramatically gone up since all of those promises, or dare we say lies, were told, we're now told that, well, he won't rule out 275, but everything's changed, and that was all the modelling before Ukraine, even though the actual policy was announced after Ukraine and Russia had gone to war. Swept under the rug, nothing to see here. Remember the central promise of the Prime Minister that if you elected a Labor government, then the cost of living would go down. No asterisks, no ifs, no buts, no maybes, but of course, all of it has gone through the roof. Even to this very day, things remain to go through the roof. Everything from the aforementioned petrol prices through to the insurances, like we've spoken about in the past couple of days. Again, swept under the rug. Oh, because there's a too little too late tax cut of $15 for people earning $45,000. Please, pull the other one, it plays jingle bells. There, of course, was the scenario of a Prime Minister of Australia making the organiser of a domestic violence rally cry because he forced himself onto the stage. Oh, but he says the tape completely exonerates himself. Well, that tape doesn't look too great, Prime Minister. And even when asked about what he had done to this woman, again, reach for the broom.
Look, with regard to Sarah, I wish her well. I wish her well.
And rather than getting a meeting of state and territory leaders to get together to change bail laws in this country, that if anyone has form in domestic violence, that if they go before a court again, they will have no option. No bail will be available. Instead, the big announcement.
We will introduce legislation to ban the creation and distribution of deepfake pornography.
When people were screaming, "Where's the Jews?" or, as you heard, "Gas the Jews," at the front of the Opera House the night after people had died, after Hamas had murdered people in Israel, the Prime Minister did not call out the protesters, did not sic the intelligence services onto these people, who, by the way, were not reacting to Israel's response. No, they were in joyous celebration at the death of people in Israel, and as we told you at the time, these were people who made their way to the Opera House because that was where a memorial was being lit up for the people who had died, and the people in the Jewish community deserve their moment to mourn. But no, the police in New South Wales turned around and said there were too many people to deal with it, and the Prime Minister quickly turned the conversation into both sides.
Islamophobic, Islamophobia, Islamophobia, Islamophobia.
Under the rug, under the rug. When a teenager was accused of a terrorist act in the stabbing of a Christian preacher, the Prime Minister did not call an emergency meeting of the National Security Committee. He did not make great visible movements to say that radicalisation was beginning to get out of control in the country. Instead, it was all about having a crack at Elon Musk.
Just shows his arrogance. This is an egotist, totally out of touch. He clearly sees this as a vanity project for himself.
Under the rug, under the rug. Well, the rug's getting a few lumps in it. In fact, a rug now looks a little bit more like a skate park in terms of how many bumps are in there. Oh, but there's plenty more, including after a collection of teenagers who, police allege, had a connection to the person who is alleged to have performed the crime in the church. Again, no special treatment from the Prime Minister to say this country was starting to have a problem with people born in this country, yet radicalised in this country. Again, under the rug. Instead, this Prime Minister did not reverse his decision that the boss of ASIO, or ASIS, would have a permanent spot in the National Security Committee. Instead, the person who now addresses them, the Climate Change Department, is now considered by this government to be more important in a security committee than the people actually in charge of our security services. Yet again, he reaches for the broom after a teenager is killed after an apparent extremist act involving a knife in the suburbs of Perth. The Prime Minister did not jump in front of a camera, did not pick up a phone to do a radio interview. Instead, he sent a tweet. You know, the same place that you wish the Socceroos well in their next football game. The same place where you put out messages like, "May the 4th be with you." This is about as little as a Prime Minister could actually do. And when confronted again about all of this today, the Prime Minister reaches for an even bigger broom to try to sweep it under the rug. An extraordinary attempt to lump a whole collection of things together when today was the day to talk about the 9th example of a kid born in this country who is being radicalised in this country.
It's an issue for our entire society, whether it be violent extremism, misogyny and violence against women. It is an issue that, of course, I'm concerned about. It's something that authorities are concerned about, but it's something that parents are concerned about as well.
The Prime Minister couldn't care what you and I think, but when he talks about his legacy and thinks about his legacy, I repeat, he's much more in the Rudd and Gillard realm of things than he's anywhere near Hawke and Whitlam. But any decent Australian and any decent Australian leader would step up at a moment like this to calm the nerves of Australians. The only thing the Prime Minister should have publicly done today was to have meetings with our security officials. He can do it in Sydney, he can do it in Canberra, he can do it telelinked to Perth. But of course, no. Because what this Prime Minister does is he thinks that if he just keeps going on like everything's normal, you will forget that some very abnormal things are happening right now. As this cartoon quite correctly shows, Prime Minister, you're going to need a bigger rug. Meantime, again, enough of the games, the word games that are being played in and around what took place in Perth, the people who police believe have been radicalised in Sydney. And once again, the police are very definite here that this teenager had been radicalised years earlier, potentially as young as 14, when the police last had some sort of contact with him. Well, again, I'll leave their words to explain just how serious today is and just how inadequate, by extension, the Prime Minister's lack of rage, lack of anger, lack of a line being crossed is on full display.
There are indications he had been radicalised online, but I want to reassure the community. At this stage, it appears that he acted solely and alone.
We will learn in the coming days. While he may well have acted alone, was he inspired alone? Certainly, that is the suggestion in New South Wales not to have been the case. But then we have this scenario, and I talked about it within hours of things that were playing out in Sydney last week when teenagers who had been allegedly radicalised were being brought before police. It's this suggestion that by somehow talking about this in any way, shape or form, or talking about what potentially they have been radicalised with, that somehow is an attack on all members of the Islamic community in Australia. It's not true. And the people who pump this garbage out also know that it's not true, but it is just a deflection. It is yet another attempt, dare I say, to sweep it under the rug, but also to change the subject, quickly move on. In the Australian newspaper today, senior imams and senior Islamic figures were concerned about some of the language that was being used. Ethnic community leaders also told The Australian that they feared anti-Muslim sentiment could ratchet up as more details emerge about the teens' deeply troubling behaviour in recent years. For goodness sake. Late on Saturday, well, you've heard the rest of that story. The concern here is not how do we make sure that the kids in our community stay on the right path and follow the religion as the extreme, 99.9% of Muslims do in this country. No, no, no. Instead, it was about, well, all the evil people who will point out what went wrong here somehow will come back as some sort of a backlash against the Muslim community. Now, I'll say it very clearly, again, for anyone who's listening, for the umpires, for the people ready to run off to the censors, if anyone, in any way, shape or form, attacks somebody in this country, it is not acceptable. I've talked about this from common assault to domestic violence to racially motivated behaviours through to extremism in all of its forms. But I'm not going to change the subject from the fact that in the past month, 9 teenagers have been found by the police after 2 of those teenagers revealed themselves to be people who wanted to harm, allegedly in the name of a bastardised version of their faith. This continues. The Australian National Imams Council says, the incident is a matter for police to manage and it considers it appropriate. And it is not appropriate to make other statements, and care needs to be taken to avoid drawing any inferences based on little information which is known to the community. Members of the Islamic community are part of the reason why police were able to make the decision that they did, because they told us the messages that the teenager was sending. The Islamic community has been as much attacked as any other member of the Australian community, but to pretend we can't tell you what he said, we can't tell you what he wrote, we can't tell you what was his alleged motivations is, in my view, completely unnecessary. Another example, somebody who is not Islamic but claims to be an advocate for new immigrants to the country, particularly in Western Australia. This bloke says that this really needs to be seen as mental health, not an issue of religion or race. Well, race, the person was Caucasian. So that's not part of this picture that many of the advocates wish to push against. But what about the concept of religion? It was not a devout and crazed love of the West Coast Eagles that this kid was writing about as justification for the behaviours that he did. We cannot always change the subject when the subject becomes difficult, because if we don't confront what is difficult and we just pretend nothing's happening, it gets worse. What problem in your life gets better by not talking about it? Again, in Western Australia, one of the released detainees by the High Court, bungled by this federal government when they came out, has been accused of, as you know, a horrific bashing in Western Australia. As you know, this person had an ankle bracelet on them, so we knew where they would be. That ankle bracelet was removed. It was removed by a body that was set up by the Albanese government and allegedly was some sort of arm's length arrangement from government. In fact, the Prime Minister tried to pretend that it had nothing to do with the government.
They make their decisions independent. Well, they make the decisions independent. One of the things that we have in this country is a separation there.
The Community Protection Board is, of course, a board that's independent of politicians. It's not appropriate for me to comment on individual cases.
Well, the far right-wing Australian Broadcasting Corporation, I think that's what it's called, the ABC, as we told you last night, had reporting over the weekend that made it very clear that the ultimate and final say potentially could well be the minister about whether or not things like ankle bracelets come off people. That idiot minister, of course, is none other than Andrew Giles. Now, this is the immigration minister who hopelessly, open-mouthed, bumbles from situation to situation, who looks over a system but then denies how the system is supposed to actually work. And guess what? The Prime Minister's lie last week was confirmed today by none other than clueless Claire O'Neill. The body that decided whether there was or wasn't an ankle bracelet is not independent from government.
Well, it is a part of the government, but it's a group of experts who are making decisions and recommendations to a delegate within the Home Affairs Department. And so, you know, it's not independent in the sense that it's not a separate structure from government.
And as the ABC reported, as the Australian Border Force confirmed, all of this, the paperwork can go all the way up to the minister. Why didn't it in this case, or if it did, will we ever see it? Compare what I've been talking about for the best part of the past few minutes and compare that with the alternative Prime Minister and ask yourself, is there any comparison between the person and the people who want to constantly sweep things under the rug, or the bloke who actually wants to deal with problems?
My first job as Prime Minister after the election will be to make sure that we keep our country safe and secure. You have to make tough decisions to make sure that that is the case, and you have to deal with the law and order crime issue that is prevalent across our community at the moment. Under a government I lead, as I demonstrated when I was Minister for Home Affairs, we make the decisions to kick these people out when they've caused harm against Australian citizens. I won't tolerate these people being in our local community. And I ramped up the number of deportations as Home Affairs Minister to a record level because I didn't want them repeating more crimes against Australians.
Good on him. Another problem that exists all over the country is the problem with renting. This government is obsessed with adding more people to the rental queues, which of course pushes up the rents. The rents on Australians who are desperately trying to hold on to a place to live. And we learn today that the median rent, which is different than average, but still, the median rent in this country is going up, and dramatically so. This all from the government that said, oh, we're going to deal with cost of living, we'll do everything. Instead, they just tip in more people, that pushes up demand for fewer properties, and you get this. Where Sydney's up by basically 9%, Canberra, Perth, more expensive in median rent than Melbourne, Darwin, Adelaide and finally Hobart, which actually did have an ever so slight decrease, but basically the same as where it was 12 months ago. Another couple of quick things I want to get through in the in-basket tonight, because there's a lot of news and a big debate tonight. We're looking forward to it in the show. You know how Chris Bowen constantly says, you've got to jump into an EV. It's the only future. Save the planet by plugging in your car. And I, in fairness, don't really have a huge problem with electric vehicles in that if you choose to do it, great, good luck to you. I understand all of the advantages of it, but for the vast majority of Australians, it's not the car that they want to buy. But there's another reason why maybe you should think twice. According to the Financial Review today, your electric car is watching your every move. Who have they gone to for this? None other than that far right-wing person, the Privacy Commissioner, who actually works for this government. Cars are now kind of computers on wheels. That means they're collecting a lot of information about individuals, including location information chiefly, which tells a lot of other things about individuals, including about sensitive personal life. The Commissioner goes on to say, there's a lot of data being collected here, not a lot of transparency or understanding about how that data is being used. But, you know, you should get an electric car because you can save the planet. And then the saving of the planet also means they'll be able to know every single place you go. Now, I've been critical of the Tasmanian Premier, Jeremy Ratcliffe, but I've got to say, he saw something on the horizon, he backed himself in, and now he's won. Jeremy Ratcliffe, of course, in part, ended up fighting a state election where he ended up with a minority, but still it was all about whether or not Tasmania would get a football team. They're going to. It will be heavily subsidised by the taxpayer. Yes, it will. But then will they build a stadium? Jackie Lambie, of course, and others said, no, this isn't going to happen over my dead body. Well, guess what? The Labor Party today have turned around and said they are going to support the building of the stadium. So Jeremy Ratcliffe, he drew a line in the sand, and now he's actually won. He will actually end up having a monument that Tasmania will like or dislike, but he has changed the face of Tasmania. So I say congratulations, because many pitfalls, return to power, and he even gets the Labor Party to go along with him. And finally, before we get to our debate tonight, I want to talk about the United States. Donald Trump, now you've got to say, if nothing else, the bloke's got a pair of stones on him. How many weeks in a row has he been sitting in a courtroom where, yes, he will be found guilty, in front of a judge who, yes, will try to throw the book at him, but still he's out and about, obviously campaigning for the president. But if it was you or I, well, we'd all be probably sucking our thumbs in the corner about what was coming our way. And when he's going out into random events where normally politicians don't go, are they booing the threat to democracy? Not really. This is what happened when he went to the Miami Grand Prix yesterday in Florida. Now, it is fair to say that the court trials over the trial that's been playing out in court in the past couple of weeks are starting to have an effect when it comes to polling. Now, of course, it's not about a national election. Remember, it's about several states inside it. But you can basically see 44 apiece, with 8% saying that they're going to vote for anybody else. 4% say they're not going to vote at all. So where that 8% goes is kind of everything that matters. But interestingly, there's an awful lot of conversation that is happening right now in and around the polls, including a difficulty that may well put Trump in a bit of a spot of bother, which is, will he accept the results of the election should he lose again?
When you look at issue polling on the economy or immigration, inflation, crime, on a whole host of issues, Americans prefer Donald Trump over the current president, Joe Biden. They think he will do a better job on issues of American prosperity and law and order. But the polling is pretty close, pretty evenly split between Trump and Biden nationally. And in large part, that is because of behavior like this.
And then there's one little thing that I do want to nip in the bud here, which is that if you are a mega Trump fan, if you are somebody who would vote for him if you had the opportunity, can we kind of nip one little thing in the bud, that he'd be okay to go to jail?
these useful idiots who want to put him in jail probably don't understand that if he was sentenced to jail, that would guarantee his victory in November.
Now, that may be the case, but if he ended up in a jail cell before November, I don't think the bloke who lives in a giant gold tower and lives with a supermodel wife would actually be that excited about an 8x10 cell.
Most people I talk to who know Trump pretty well do not think that he actually really wants to go to jail. I don't think he wants to sit in that courtroom every day. Do people think that jail is going to be a more pleasant experience for him?
Trump doesn't even like to stay in hotel rooms. I remember on foreign trips when he was president, he didn't even like staying in other hotel rooms.
In a moment or two's time, the Prime Minister finally grilled over yet another series of lies when it comes to his government's culpability and lack of security of people who should be monitored 24/7 or still behind bars because they're not refugees. The debate starts next. Thanks for watching. Paul Murray live on a Monday. Thank you so much for watching. Now, in the previous hour with the wonderful Shari Markson, she had a fascinating conversation with Josh Frydenberg, who I know is so deeply affected by the events that have been taking place in Israel and here at home in relation to anti-Semitism. And he's going to be working with us on a special presentation in a few weeks' time. And I'm pleased to say that we can now tell you that this special presentation is coming to air in the next couple of weeks.
Did you believe, after surviving the Holocaust, that you would ever feel unsafe in Australia simply because you were Jewish?
Never. What's happening now, it's the same ideology, suddenly turning and becoming really hostile against Jews.
People need to be aware that this is happening.
One thing we must unite on is to completely repudiate any return of anti-Semitism. They were words of hate.
The philosophy of some level of extermination.
Surely, in modern Australia, we're better than that.
Just a little bit of anti-Semitism is okay. That thought has crept into the national psyche or into the psyche of some of our leaders.
People will have different views about Israel, about Palestine.
If you, as a Holocaust survivor, had the opportunity to speak to the Prime Minister of Australia today.
Be aware of what's going on around you. Speak out for us. Lead.
What's your message to these Holocaust survivors?
That Australians stand with you, that we're honoured to have you as part of our Australian community.
Speak out on the right side of history.
Big stuff. A couple of weeks here on Sky News. Speaking of big stuff, let's get right into nothing but red meat when it comes to the conversation we're going to have here. The wonderful James Morrow, Daily Telegraph and Outsiders. The wonderful Sam Crosby. I don't like introducing you that kindly, but anyway, later his bootstraps. And the man who just was regaled with the stories of how Anthony Albanese, apart from sweeping every single issue under the rug, has saved the beef industry. Beef Week in Rockhampton, of course, none other than Senator Matt Canavan. How were the farmers reacting to the farmers' king, the boy from Marrickville, and was Toto with him?
Well, I think a lot of them are cleaning it up right now behind me, Paul. I probably don't want to say the word on TV, but you can probably see a bit of it being shovelled up into various wheelbarrows around the place. They're still working hard here at Beef Week. It's been a fantastic day all week. Celebration of all things red meat.
Good stuff. Good to see. All right, well said. Now, The Nightly, which is owned by Seven West Media, they do, obviously by its name, an evening news service. They have got their hands on a video of what they believe to be one of the actions of this teenager who has been thankfully stopped by police after an alleged stabbing. I don't know why I have to say alleged after somebody's dead, but we get the point. That took place in that Bunnings car park over the weekend. Well, we'd heard that it had a bit of a penchant for hurting things and certainly blowing things up. Here is something that he did to a school toilet.
James, get away!
Now, the whole point being, is he just mucking around with the boys, or was he starting to learn about the potential of what you need to do to put two and two together to make something terrible happen? But let's jump to the bigger issue here. James, Paul, there is a growing madness where we have now seen 9 teenagers born here, sent mad here, in service of radical Islam.
Yes.
I'm not going to fall into that. Let's not spend 25 minutes with all the asterisks. We all say it's all not the overall community, all of that right. But the Prime Minister today tries to lump it all in with misogyny and everything else. What is going on with the rising madness in this country, particularly when it comes to radicalised youth?
Well, I think it's the same thing, Paul, that we're seeing everywhere else in the world. We've seen for years and years and years in Europe especially, but also in the United States. You know, and it brings up an awful lot of issues that I think Anthony Albanese doesn't want to discuss. One of them is the nature of how Islam can be interpreted, and not infrequently is in service of violent ideologies and jihad. Putting that aside, though, there's also a great confusion, I think, particularly on the left. And it comes down to a number of things, the most fundamental thing being that, you know, they want to defend Australian values, but they're not fully comfortable with Australia. I mean, there's that problem. You see that in the curriculum, and you saw that with the voice referendum. And you also see this now with the way in which the whole conflict in the Middle East is playing out, not just in the streets, but in the polls, and the way Jason Clare, who represents Blaxland, which has, I think, the highest or second highest Muslim population of an electorate in the country, had to be rebuked for saying, well, intifada can mean lots of different things to lots of different people. And as long as you've got people out there saying things like that, and good on the Prime Minister, I think, for pulling Jason Clare into line, you can't have the serious conversation about this issue.
I mean, again, as I said last night about Jason Clare, agree or disagree with somebody like an Ed Husick, he's absolutely clear about how he views the issue and what's happening right now in Gaza, okay? Claire sort of trying to be the all things to all people scenario means you either don't believe in any of it or sort of trying to all sides it. There ain't no Goldilocks position here, right? And certainly when people are starting to use the terms that have been used. But Sam, it seems to me, and I was thinking about this a lot over the weekend, right, that Labor thought they were doing the right thing between 2007 and 2013, basically, when it came to boats. And every time a boat arrived, those of us who said they were doing the wrong thing saw it as, see this, see this, see this, until eventually the recognition had to be, no, we got right and wrong the different way around. I think the Prime Minister is trying to play this idea of don't pump it all up. If we pump it up, then somehow the Islamic community is going to become the focus of retribution, all the rest of it. I would just like to see the same rage that he has about passing housing legislation, about the failure of something in our society when kids born in this country would plan or do turn against citizens of this country.
So I guess the first thing to say is I have no idea, and if I did, we would all know and we would all do something about it, right? So it's all just, you know, complete speculation on all our parts. That said, I think the critical part here is the radical part, not the Islam part.
Absolutely, of course, we've said that.
No, sure. But I think if we let's focus on the radicalisation part. How are these kids? What are these kids watching? What is this stream of evil that is being embedded into their, you know, their phones, their tablets, whatever? How is that getting into their brains and distorting whatever wires are crossed in there already? And leading them down this path. I mean, you know, over the last couple of weeks we were talking about the internet censoring, and this is where the rubber hits the road, right? These kids are sitting in their rooms, in their bedrooms generally, watching videos of people getting beheaded. And the people leading the charge behind the scenes, sometimes in front of the camera, but the people leading the charge saying, no, let's cut this stream of violence off. It's not the lefty do-gooder, you know, hippie flower power children. It's the police. It's the AFP. It's the security agencies. They're the ones saying we need to take this material down.
Yeah, but I haven't heard the Prime Minister talk about taking down the hate preachers. Now, of course, the words and the incendiary words of the hate preachers are, in my view, what feeds into that sense of radicalisation. Instead, deepfake pornography, the commission of a crime, a whole collection of other things they want to jump on top of here. But, Senator, again, we've got a problem here. We've got a problem, but it seems the PM is just tap it down, as opposed to stare it in the face.
Well, I think Sam's half pregnant here. I disagree with you, Sam. Yes, there's a radical element here, but there's also an Islamic element. And one of the problems we've got right now is the police stopped calling it Islamic extremism a few years ago at the behest of Islamic leaders, and we're now not focusing on the real issues. In fact, this government's so distracted that they set up a whole Senate inquiry to look at right-wing extremism in this country. They refused to expand the terms of reference, despite our urgings to in the Senate, to include Islamic extremism as well. They just used as a political hit job on right-wing extremists. And they've totally taken their eye off the ball, the fact that there is a problem with radical Islam. There are not too many Methodists martyring themselves around the world. There is a problem with radical Islam. We've got to be able to talk about that and be upfront about it if we're actually going to tackle it. If we tiptoe around it by using these vague terms, catch-all phrases, we'll never squash it. We'll never get rid of it. And so we've got to tackle this head-on. And you're absolutely right. It does start in those mosques with some preachers. They've got to be held to account here, but the Labor Party seems not to want to do that because of its political support it gets from those communities in Western Sydney.
But there is an example of, I think, how to handle this, or at least the beginnings of how to handle it, and it is the way Chris Minns has done it, right? Which is when something terrible happens, you call in as many faith leaders as possible into a room so they all come out with the same message, equally so. A serious want to focus on the law enforcement side of this. But again, today, the only thing I wanted to see my Prime Minister do was to pull people with levels of responsibility together to acknowledge there is something to deal with. Instead, what he does every day is he doesn't call anything special, he doesn't cancel an event. Instead, he's always off just making it look like it's day 622 of the 2022 election.
I mean, look, there's so many precedents for this. Go back to when the October 7th atrocities occurred. The Prime Minister was up in the Northern Territory waiting for Pat Farmer to finish a road race in support of The Voice. And he had to be dragged kicking and screaming to a synagogue, a temple in Melbourne, to go and say something to the Jewish community there and to call his National Security Committee together, which is exactly what the community was expecting him to do in that point. I think there is a bigger piece about integration and multiculturalism that we need to talk about here, because I do not want to see what has happened in Britain and places like 100%. That, where you have people coming in, hijacking our electoral system to then gain office, not to represent their constituents, but to represent their issue over there. And the fact that you cannot take, that there's even an attempt to be a Goldilocks position, on this whole situation. You can say, the Palestinians, the Israelis need to respect their human rights. But, all of the stuff that the left is calling for, if they really cared about the Palestinians, they would say, Hamas, why don't you surrender? Give up the hostages. Sinwar, surrender. But they don't do that because that's not what it's about. Well, it's about Israel for the left.
When you talk as well about, again, these issues of the world coming down to playing out in our politics here, literally somebody was throwing eggs at the Queensland Premier today as part of allegedly pro-Palestine protesting. Look, what does the Queensland... Seriously, it's garbage. Quick break, back with more. I want to talk about an interview that Scott Morrison gave on television last night, talking about the psychological warfare that was waged on him, how he handled it and how he didn't. More in a second. Thanks for watching. Here with none other than the wonderful James Morrow. The reason I giggle is because I can't wait for whatever sound effect we're going to get out the back of what's happening behind Matt Canavan. Not out the back of Matt Canavan, but he's at Beef Week right now in Rockhampton. The wonderful Sam Crosby is here as well.
Hopefully it's just sound, Paul. Hopefully there's no images along with it.
Oh, you gave us a beautiful mental image earlier in the program. Now, as we know, Scott Morrison's written a book. It's about his faith, but it's also about faith, the life of a Prime Minister, and he's given a couple of interviews. He gave one last night on Channel 7 about that emotional toll. We all know what came at him. James, in the end, you weren't a great fan of the former Prime Minister, fair to say. Mm-hmm. Right, good.
Oh, we have a mixed legacy.
Okay, got a mixed legacy.
Yeah.
However, there is something that I think is interesting to note, right, which is that we've all seen harsh political campaigns, but it did feel like a certain type of psychological warfare, and I don't know how any human being was going to be able to come up against that. But how do you feel about talking about it in the way that the former PM is?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting, isn't it? Because, I mean, we know that the, there was that just utterly relentless campaign around Morrison in a way I don't think we've ever seen with a prime minister. I mean, there was some of it around Howard, but there was something about Morrison, and it was a kind of a dialectic between him and his enemies that they kind of fed off each other in a pretty interesting way. And, there was something about Scott Morrison, because he was so normal, it made his enemies absolutely furious. I mean, one of the greatest things you could say about Scott Morrison is his absolute genuine love for his wife, Jenny, and his 2 daughters. And it's like this normal suburban existence, of course, is what the progressive left detests. And so they made him the focus of, they made him the scapegoat. He bore the sins of what they perceived as Australia and its failings because it's too, white picket fence and everything else.
Thank you, Cal.
God, you read a lot into into
I
that.
do read a lot into that.
That's a lot.
Okay, but think about this, right? If Scott Morrison had walked out of a national cabinet meeting, gave a press conference about domestic violence, but then answered a question about whether the coach of his footy team should have been sacked, what would the reaction have been? What was it with Albo? Nothing. Yeah. So that's the level about the psychological warfare. But again, Matt, as a person who takes on the left but also can feel what comes back, look, I fight hard, so I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I'm not somebody who plays the ball as hard as I can, and if occasionally the man cops it, that's the way it seems to be, because that's the way they've played it in the past. But what do you think about either the clarion call of we've gone too far, or that's just the way it is these days?
Well, look, politics is a contact sport, and we have an adversarial system, so it's always going to be tough, and I can't imagine what the pressures are like being at the top job. I didn't notice this, like many others. I didn't know Scott was going through this until he's revealed it. So I don't know what led to it, of course. But if I could just say one thing, I think we need to normalise the ability of prime ministers to have a holiday with their family. That was the most shocking thing to me over the last few years. I mean, sure, go after people on their policies, your disagreements with them on how the country should be run. But for God's sake, let someone have a holiday with their family, even if they want to go overseas. Like, we maybe should mandate that they go overseas. They should get out of the country. They could have a break. And can you imagine the pressure that put on his family when this is probably the first holiday they'd taken for many years together, and the pressure that came down him to leave his kids and his wife. And I found that distasteful at the time. I said that I got a big row on the ABC at the time with someone about it, but it was just brutal. And as I say, I don't know if that contributed anything, but maybe if we want these sort of things not to happen to our leaders, we should let them have a break from time to time.
Or in the same way, the UK Prime Minister has Chequers, the American President has Camp David, I don't know, some special ranch right out the back of Queensland where they can go and hang out.
He's got Kirribilli House, it's not bad.
I was going to say, and there's the one, okay, they've got enough houses.
Bad.
Thank you, lads, do appreciate it. We'll talk bigger issues, including rent and a whole bunch of things, at another time, because we're out of time right now, about 5 minutes away from the late debate here on Sky News. Thanks for watching. That's our show for tonight. Thank you very much for watching. Now, lots of ways you can get in touch with us. The main way is, of course, via email. You can send that each and every day. And if you've got stories, ideas, things you see in the news, things you see on the telly, here on the radio that you think we should be talking about here, please, paul@skynews.com.au, paul@skynews.com.au. Now, in regional Australia, tomorrow I'm going to tell you a great story. Now, obviously, there's an awful lot of tough and difficult stories that are around, but the story I'm going to tell you tomorrow is about how an entire town, the town of Longreach, has decided that they're going to play a month-long game of tip. Literally. This is a citywide thing, so somebody just randomly walks up to you and says, "You're it in Longreach." Nothing's wrong. You're just part of a game that's bigger than you. Here's the late debate.